Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, we are from group 6 and right now we are going to present about postcolonial theory. And before we start our presentation, let me introduce ourselves. My name is Diandra Canny Altari.
My name is Mazaya Puti Jasmine.
And let's start with our presentation in which the first half of the material will be presented by me. Okay, so what is postcolonial theory? Postcolonial theory is a method of interpreting, reading, and critiquing the cultural practices of colonialism, where it proposes that the exercise of colonial power is also the exercise of racially. And postcolonial theory focuses on question of race within colonialism and shows how the optic of race enables colonial powers to represent, reflect, refract, and make visible native cultures in particular ways. It begins with the assumption that colonial writing, arts, legal system, science, and other socio-cultural practices are always racialized and unequal, where the colonial does the representation and the native is represented. And the next material is about opening moves. The first one is from the imperial turn by Gandhi, anti-colonial struggle, and the early post-colonial. Gandhi Satyagraha system of protest was a local and indigenous form of struggle that was based on a larger idea of non-violence. Passive resistance and personal discipline become the key modes of struggle. In addition, his vegetarianism, support for local languages and culture, and the anti-industrial stance all constituted key early elements in what postcolonial theory after Fanon would consolidate, namely cultural nationalism and cultural affirmation. Gandhi's major contribution to postcolonial thought can be best identified as a moral one, which is perhaps why he does not sit quite well with Marxist postcolonial theory, because his notion of Swaraj or self-rule was, as Robert Young notes, directed at both the nation and the individual, asserting moral superiority of both individual and the culture against the colonial ruler, for example, by not hitting back when beaten, was Gandhi's master stroke. The turn to moral resistance in Gandhi was also linked to religion. His effective deployment of the moral drew upon Hinduism and may well have contributed to the schism within the Indian National Congress between the Hindus and the Muslims. The use of Hinduism as a means of forging a cultural and national identity alienated large sections of leaders and the population, and cleverly exploited by political leaders, resulted in the disaster that was partition. And the next is Franz Fanon and the psychopathology of colonialism. Fanon's insight into psychology of colonialism was simply this: when the colonial paints the native as evil, pagan, and primitive, over a period of time, the native begins to accept his prejudice and racialized view as true. As a result, the native comes to see himself as evil, pagan, and primitive. The black man loses his sense of self-identity because he can only see himself through the eyes of the white man. Cannon argues, Cannon argues that for the native, the term man itself begins to mean white man because he does not see himself as a man at all. In terms of culture, the native extends this accepted notion to believe that the only values that matter are those of the white man. The build out the build up of this sense of inadequacy and inferiority in the colonized side result in violence. Violence, as written by Fanon, is a form of self-assertion. When the native discovers that he cannot hope to become truly white or even expel the whites, his violence erupts against his own people. In Fanon's opinion, tribal wars are an instance of this the violence generated through the colonial system where the rich turn upon each other, haunted by a failure to turn against the colonial master. Fanon recognized the significance of cultural nationalism when he propounded the idea of a national literature and national culture in his essay of the same title in Wretch of the Earth, leading to a national consciousness. His deployment of the term national culture was an attempt to plead for a greater pan-African cause, and not just narrow sectarian tribal ones. The blacks had to create their own history, write their own stories, and it is through this control over representation that the native can break free of the colonial shackles. Fanon astutely noted that culture must be dynamic and open to change. When he spoke of the third stage of the development of a national culture, he was proposing not an ossified or stable culture or tradition, but one that must be critically evaluated so as to bring incitable changes. In other words, Cannon was keen on traditions and cultural practices as responsive to changing historical circumstances, rather than staying fixed in its older forms. Next is Aim Society, Leopold Senghor, and Negritude. Amy Cesare is best known for his term negritude. Negritude was the cultural response of the native to the onslaught by colonialism culture. Cesare argued that colonialism, evangelical and reformist mission was essentially a farce. Colonialism was never a benevolent enterprise because it was spearheaded by the pirate, the opportunist, and the adventurer and the merchant. There is nothing other than profit as a motive behind the colonial project. Native cultures are rejected by the colonial, and negritude evolves as a means of battling this rejection. Negritude is the black colonized people salvaging of their own identity and consciousness. Influenced by the Harlem Renaissance of African Americans and the Black arts movements in the USA, Caesar's negritude was characterized by a cultural separatism and the rejection of assimilation of the colonial culture by Africans. And the next is Edward Said, Orientalism and the Postcolonial Movement. Edward Said saw colonialism as a project that was undeniably military political. However, colonialism also had a discursive component. That is, the primitive or pagan East was the literary discursive creation of the European imagination that then begins to be accepted as true. What Said is interested in here is the literary documentary and ideological construction of the non-European cultures in European text and thought.
By discursive construction, site means that the apparatuses of representation such as archaeology, literary, history, music, ethnography, political theory, and social commentary used by the European colonial powers to talk about the East in a certain way. Side argued that this representation of the East was integral to the conquest of the East. The epistemological domination of the East through documented knowledge and archivization enabled Europe to obtain and retain power. Said's major contribution was to see colonialism as rooted in an epistemological inquiry and project, constructing the Orient. Orientalism is this European construction of the East as a primitive, savage, pagan, undeveloped, and criminal. Such a construction then enabled the European to justify his presence. The poor, weak native needed to be governed and developed, and it was the task of the European to do so. Oriental reality is interpreted in particular ways that are usable by the Europeans. Orientalism demonstrated the political nature of culture, of the ideological basis of acts of imagination or literature, and the material effects of particular kinds of representation. Said located culture as central to the empire, and thus demonstrated the materiality of discourse and rhetoric. Edward Said's epoch-making work thus presents some problems. For example, Said does not account for the differences between colonialism, the French occupation of Algeria, the settler colonialism in Australia, and the British colonization of India, a problem addressed in Lisa Lowes' work in 1991, treating all colonialism as one homogeneous structure. He ignores the gendered and sexualized nature of colonial discourses, the representation of the failed Algeria woman, the innocent Indian widow who needs European male help, and the homophobic ideology of colonialism. And next is colonial discourses and English studies. The first thing that we are going to talk about is the literature of empire. The task of postcolonial literary criticism, primarily in English studies, is to locate modes of representation narratives where Europeans constructed the natives in politically significant ways. Colonial discourse is racialized, and because racial discourses fit directly into the imperial colonial system, or colonialism being the conquest and domination of one race by another, the task of postcolonial literary studies has been to unpack those literary figures, themes, and representations that have enforced in imperialist ideology, colonial dominance, and continuing Western hegemony. Within colonial discourse studies, postcolonial literary criticism has focused on the role of English literature, English language, and cultural representations, demonstrating how canonically English literature texts are imbricated in colonial structures of dominance and oppression. One of the principal critical texts in this postcolonial approach is Gauri Viswanathan's Mask of Conquest in 1989. Viswanathan demonstrates how English literature as a discipline was introduced in India by one rejecting native literary traditions in Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic, two installing English texts in their stead, and three using these texts as models of creating a class of Indians who would be trained to serve the colonial administration. Post-colonial cultural studies have included reinterpretations of other kinds of colonial writings. Thus, Mrinali Sinha in 1995, Inderpal Grewal in 1999, Antoinette Burton in 2003, Betty Joseph in 2004, and Anindita Mukhopadhyay in 2006 have worked at the interface of literary studies and history to unpack colonial ideologies in a wide variety of administrative, legal, legal and ethnographic texts. Colonial medicine has been examined, examined for its racialized vision of the tropics and for the construction of particular kinds of diseased native bodies. David Arnold, Mark Harrison, and Alan Bevel. If reinterpretation involves unpacking colonial ideologies in English literary texts, then the obverse of this critical inquiry has involved detecting modes of resistance, subversion, and dissent in English texts as well as native ones. This process of reinterpretation is the search for a colonial discourse that could be called anamorphic. Post-colonial reinterpretation work at something else. They seek not the Sagian kind of colonial discourse that dominates and controls the native, but rather the gaps and fissures within the discourse that one, actually provide the native with the means of resistance, and two, the dissenting colonial with the modes of articulating opposition. The significance of such postcolonial reinterpretations cannot be overemphasized. They show one, how not all English writing is necessarily racist or imperialist, and two, how by seeking colonial ideologies in all English texts, postcolonial readings performs the same act of homogenizing all Western literature that we once accused the West of doing to native writings. And three, that resistance is always possible even within the so-called overtly imperialist texts. And the next is about language and imperialism. Moving from literature to the language, postcolonial studies proceed to locate European languages as instruments of colonial power. Walter Mignolo, in 2003, in his grand study of European Renaissance, meticulously teases out the imperialist colonial politics of Spanish grammar books and their role in conquest of South America. This magisterial study shows how grammar, syntax, and dictionary projects are never only about language, but rather serve very devious imperial purposes and often determine interpretations in other disciplines such as education, history, and the law. The acceptance of English by natives in the colonial period created by a politics of representation because the language was racialized and gendered. English became the means of acquiring power for the native elites. With political independence, English continues to be the language of power in administration, finance, law, and increasingly global commerce. And the metropolitan sites and English-speaking minority are able to dominate post-colonial societies.
Thank you for Keken. And the next material is subject and subalternity. A key element in the postcolonial studies in the examination of the process through which the native is rendered a marginalized subject with little agency or identity. Okay, a key figure in the postcolonial analysis of the interpolation of the native subject is Homi Bhabha. Bhabha's work reveals how the colonial discourse that sought to impose an indirectional flow of power, colonizer to colonize, and a monolithic structure often failed. Bhabha's work on mimicry, ambivalence, and hybridity radically interrogates the effectiveness in or of colonial discourse, all the while pointing to fractures. Bhabha's proposed that colonial discourse is actually conflictual and ambivalent. Due to conflicting circumstance, this result is in stereotyping of the original subject. Bhabha argues that the festival or public structures of colonial relation produce condition in which white people sought and desire the other while also wanting to erase differences. Babas then proposed a fragmented colonial discourse and an indigenous subject whose subject position is never stable or automatic, just as the position of colonial rulers is never stable or automatic, and the result is repetition of stereotypes. Baba's work reveals colonial discourse as unstable, fractured, ambivalent, and open to subversion. Extending their argument about the potential resistance by the native subject, Babas proposed the idea of mimicry and man. Mimicry is the disciplined imitation of the white man by the natives. The native has been taught consistently that he needs to try and ape the white man and his culture. The mimic man here appears to follow the white man authority to show the power of colonial discourse, but in effect fractures and disrupt it. Mimicry here reveals the breaks in the colonial discourse. The native represent themselves rather than be represented. This step of double mimicry practiced by native people, which is a direct result of fragmentation of colonial discourse, is what Baba termed hybridity. According to Baba, the hybridized native who refuse to return to colonial guests and acknowledge the colonizer's position and authority is placed in a position of in-betweenness between adopted Englishness and original Indianness. The hybridity creates a third space, a space of realization between colonizer and colonized. This is a site where colonial identity and native identity meet and often contest. Colonial discourse is both or at once asserted and subverted. This is there is difference and difference. There is a split and negotiation within colonial discourse. Mimicry and mockery occur. The third place is where the subject begins articulating resistance. The subject for Baba is thus the split, the censored, unstable, and resistant one. This reading of the colonial subject by Baba can be contraposed with the one by Gayatri Spivak, another theorist whose work with post-structuralism, feminism, and Marxism has resulted in now called texts in the post-colonial canon. Spivak's influential ideas about the subaltern tectonical force of patriarchy and colonialism that indigenous women, because of their location within these two structures, are unstable to express and are instead always spoken to by intellectuals. A process that Spivak criticized because, in her opinion, it is better to let women remain on the periphery of discourse, thus distracting him, rather than speaking on his behalf and thus rendering him increasingly silent. Spivak is also critical of all attempts by intellectuals to take back the voice of subaltern. Spivak's step is to argue that all ideas and representation of subaltern or third place, women's consciousness consciousness are constructions of Western discourse. This discourse built the subaltern and give it a voice. According to Spivak, there is an urgent need to create an ethical response to the voice of subaltern groups. Noting how quickly subaltern groups have been appropriated by theorists and thinkers, Spivak addressed the theme of institutions. Spivak is particularly sharp in his critique of the institutionalization and thus romanticization of subaltern groups. He argues that this appropriation, which continually emphasizes that the viewpoint of the ethnic minorities, will ensure that their marginality is maintained. Here, the discipline of postcolonial studies becomes suspect because for Spivak, it presents the West longing for the other. Next is gender, sexuality, and the empire. The empire, argue feminist critics, has always been seen primarily as a race project. This has resulted in the advancement of the woman in study of colonialism. The contemporary post-colonial theories focus on gender and race and has been instrumental in the rise of Black feminist theory and critics of Western feminism. In early work, Kristen Hall Patterson and Anna Rutherford proposed that women in colonialism experience a double colonization. Valuable points to start an exploration of the gender and sexual nature of colonialism start from the discussion at the extraordinary, oppressive, and circumscribed context of woman life in colonialism, trapped by or within both patriarchy and colonialism. The empire was always primarily as a masculine adventure. Discovery, exploration, conquest, and rule were acts and symbol of the European male's dominance of the world. Signs of such dominance are scattered through through European literature in terms of exploration. These themes include the sexual one, the exploration of the Arab harem, the protection of the native woman by the ultra-macho European males, and the instrumental use of European women by the European male in the imperial project. However, when European women set out into the outposts of the empire, the relation with the native or the ex were not so reductively imperial. Women experience the East or colony differently from their men. Thus, European women in colonized had multiple modes of dealing with the colony. Thus, the European woman has interesting and often problematic relation with the imperial project. Many fought, resisted, or supported their own cultures, part patriarchal oppression, and saw the colony as a site of possible emancipation. For the woman evangelicals in the 19th century, the mission gave them an identity otherwise denied them. When Gayatri Spivak reads colonial English woman texts such as Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, she shows how an imperialist asymmetrics determines the heroine gene move from a counter family to legal family. Spivak criticism of the novel locates the development of genes individualism as aligned with imperialism. Thus, the woman consciousness and attempt independence in the novel, which the feminist critics have seen as a significant achievement, cannot be studied in isolation from the colonial imperial context that allow the white woman to be individualist but consign women like Bertha Mason. Like Spivak and MC Clinton turns to Victorian ideas of the family and domestic city, viewing this as site where ideologies of race, gender, and sexuality are played out. The appropriate racial and gender ideology alongside that of class in order to develop a sense of modernity. The empire, as Cannibal has said, Ronald Hume and other criticism has demonstrated, was intensely concerned about the sexuality and sexual health of its personnel. The fear of miscegenation and the resultant hybridity, the fear of the rape of white women by hypersexual native men, as well as the fear that the white woman might take to native or black men, was the accompaniment to the theme of miscegenation. Later, feminist postcolonial theories shift focus from colonial texts to the nationalist anti-colonial movements. During anti-colonial struggles, the woman plays a political public supportive role, but once independence is achieved, she must revert to her domestic role. Postcolonial feminism has increasingly addressed the gender issue in post-independence nations, but Chatterjee proposed that colonial or post-colonial modernity and tradition seek power over the familial and domestic space. In a particular attitude theorization, Mary John and Jana Kinnear has introduced caste and class configurations along with the gender and nation. They write, the middle class, upper class woman has been the ground on which questions of modernity are framed. She embodies the boundaries of licit and illicit from of sexuality, and she is the guardian of the nation's morality. The woman must remain fixed and unchanging even as post-colonial nation-state change. Numerous post-colonial writers have questioned the problematic linkage of nation identity and gender roles. Imperialism, yes, imperialism also had a problematic relationship with other forms of sexuality. The fielding as this relationship and fostered a passage to India has overtones of homoerotic relationship. Homosexuality was, of course, unacceptable, but was very much present as a subterranean sexuality. Specific notion and view of masculinity and femininity and from colonial interaction with natives. Iconic figures like Richard Burton and T. Lawrence have been revealed as homosexual, whose role in imperial dominance were interesting negotiation between a masculine dynamic and their own other sexualities. Next, nation and nationalism. In most cases, the anti-colonial movement posited the idea of a nation with a continuous and common tradition. In India, for example, even the uneven rebellion of 1957 invoked the idea of the pre-British Hindustan. In post-colonial studies, the nation figures prominently in several ways. It has been argued under the influence of Benedict Anderson that the nation is a collective that exists primarily in acts of imagination and thinking, and unity that might be more fantasy than reality but is more powerful. This collective unity is generated and sustained by symbolic forms such as song, film, and cultural practice like story, tradition, and history writing. Thus, the nation is a myth with a real hold over the people. National identity is the consequence of such an enabling myth. It unites people under one umbrella, provides a sustaining form or story, and asks them to function together in the nation's name. Nationalism is the ideology and political project that emerges once this myth is implemented. The African negritude is an instance of such an effect. When the idea of an African identity was established and disseminated in became a source for imagining a common tradition. These shared traditions were then used as resistance against foreign colonial powers, becoming an argument that declare of African authentic, true, and pure, and oppose the foreigners' intrusions and falsehood. Nationalism had two components in literature and the arts. It helped writers seek a pre-colonial past that would help them define the nation, and it projected a destiny, a future shared by and the common to all people within the space of that nation. Historians, political theorists, and literary critics has interrogated national identity and its forms in recent postcolonial studies. Kartaji notes that a nation in Western India, the anti-colonial or nationalist movement, adopted the idea of progress or modernity from the West, launched the idea of the nation, and divided it into the three stages. In the first stage, the natives accept modern Western ideas of progress and modernity. In the second, the elite in the colony turned to folk and popular cultural forms to generate both mass support and new form of identity based on local cultures. Finally, in the third stage, the Western and folk cultural form are projected as native nationalism by the elite. The anti-colonial movement was based on projecting the Western model and folk elements as truly national idea. It was built on a given conceptual framework and the idea of progress and history. Therefore, Katarji calls nationalism the derivative discourse. Diandra Pandey proposed that too often national identity is constructed by the majority, while the minorities remain on the fringes of the nation as outsider, even when they are on the inside. Feminist critics of the nation ideal see the chapter of feminism have not how the nation is defined in a masculine space. Such national identity ensure that the woman is confined to the home while the public space remain that of the man, but as that the woman the carrier of the tradition. This post-colonial subalternization process suggests a post-colonial anxiety. Women, lower castes and classes, and ethnic minorities become the other within the post-colonial nation state. Post-colonial theory increasingly feels uncomfortable with the idea of nationalism or national identity because its theory is exclusive rather than inclusive, homogenizing in the name of a shared identity when real difference, cultural and economic, between societies continue to exist. The question of the nation has also become significant in the light of globalization and post-colonial studies in the late uh, nine, 19 and the 19 and 90 have turned to the new forms of a nation that emerged in a globalized network and neo-colonial world. Uh, Next is globalization and diaspora and the post-national. Globalization involves moving people, capital, and commodities across national borders. The movement of people, capital, and commodities has a strong cultural component. Globalization can be seen as a mechanism that also results in the merging of cultural practice, the assimilation of the foreign into the native, and the encounter between different cultures. Metropolises worldwide have become cosmopolitan, multicultural, and hybrid with globalization. Transnational solidarities and political alliances between anti-globalization groups ironically are forged across national borders. Globalization has also generated a new form of colonial domination, often termed neo-colonialism. It does not take the form of violent conquest, but is a more diffuse, insidious, and persistent form that makes as much use of culture as it does of political strategies. Hart and Negri argue that other forms of analysis are not adequate for the new age colonialisms. In this context of globalized cultural regimes, new forms of domination, exploitation, multiple displacements, and cultural alignments, new approaches to cultural and literature, and new forms of writing and cultural practice emerged. Diaspora. Alec Bomer described the immigrant and diasporic people or sort as the colonial by birth, third wall in cultural interest, cosmos, cosmopolitan in also every other way. These writers work within the presence of the Western metropolis while same time retaining thematic and or political connection with a national background. Postcolonial theory studies immigrant and diasporic identity as celebration of migrancy, most notably in authors like the way of locating the immigrants' intellectual cultural position is Abdul Jan Mohammed. Jan Mohammed mentioned the specular border intellectual standing at the border of two cultures, looking critically at both, neither assimilating nor combining them. Hybridity is an extension of this condition of looking toward both, between being both here and there. Concept elaborated by Homi Bhabha, hybridity is the rejection of a single or unified identity and preference for multiple cultural location and identities. Hybridity can revive a pre-colonial past such as folk or tribal cultural forms and convention within the nativist or reactionary movements, or adapt contemporary artistic and social production to present-day condition of globalization, multiculturalism, and transnationalism. With much post-colonial theory, Baba in particular, and literature, such a condition of looking back and forward, of possessing multiple identities, have been valorized as valuable state. In these latter cases, they cannot escape their racial or ethnic identity because their gender and class merge them as different and difference that cannot be overcome just because they have reached the first world. Cosmopolitanism, keeping hybridity and multiple identities at its center, as well as the possibility of transnational solidarity, recent colonial theory has explored and pushed back in the time cultural practice and political thought that cut cross national borders. Nandi argues that third world nations can ally themselves with the represent and oppressed within first world nations. Has meant that cosmopolitanism can be built on a common ethics of recognition, where we acknowledge the suffering of the other and work to fight the institutional forms of suffering everywhere. They have argued that this argument in Nandi is a utopic vision based on affect, a recognition of and response to the suffering of others. This locates Nandi within what they have termed effective cosmopolitanism. In a more recent work, Anya Lomba et al., they point out that postcolonial studies has been at various times intertwined not just with multiculturalism and ethnic studies, but also with an array of area studies, each with differing sense of its place. Postcolonial studies are integral now to critical globalization studies because they are theoretical approaches that ground cultural practices in geopolitics. Thus, postcolonial study would be able to look at the cultural practice of films within globalization. Yet such a view of globalized cultures and cosmopolitanism does not quite account for discrepancies. Uh, Howard Werner has proposed a vernacular cosmopolitanism, an opposite to the hybrid elitist cosmopolitan paradigm. Vernacular cosmopolitanism explore whether the local parochial root culturally specific and demotic may coexist with the translocal, transnational, transcendent, elitist, and enlightened, and universalist and modernist. It strongly parallels what James Clifford termed discrepant cosmopolitanism to describe the insidious, subversive, and often violently rebellious cultural interaction. It could be argued that postcolonial theory must account for such as vernacular cosmopolitanism as a counter idea to global cultures. The post-national cyber culture network provide a home in cyberspace that is not governed by actual or material geographical location. However, as Ali Bet that points out, the wake of 9/11, national identities has become important. Border control strengthened and differences, racial, ethnic, national, underscore. The idea of the post-colonial is also difficult to accept because the flow that mark globalization castle are uneven. In a grand turn to the post-colonialism globalization studies debate, Rob Nixon proposed that environmentalism could become an addition to the critique. Following Lawrence Boyle, Nixon suggests a study within post-colonial study of toxic discourse. The land claims colonial degradation, pre-colonial practice, and rewriting of nature in post-colonial literatures. In a different way, and for different purpose, Simon Daring has proposed that post-colonial study must turn to globalization studies because colonialism, post-colonial studies focused thus far has always been a form of uneven exploitative globalization. That's all for our presentation. Thank you for watching and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.